Welcome to Prajim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 32 of ASP.NET video series. In this session, we'll learn about using the ASP.NET calendar control. Let's flip to Visual Studio. In this session, we'll look at a simple real-time example of capturing date from the end user. In the next session, we'll see how to customize, the properties and events to suit our application development needs. Let's drag and drop a text box control onto the web form, which is going to store the date that we select from the calendar. Let's reduce the size of the text box, and then I'm going to have an image button, and let's have the calendar control. Okay, now the calendar control is a very rich control. Let's auto format this calendar. Alright. So now what we basically want to do, let's associate this image button to an image. I already have an image here. Let's copy that, create an images folder within our web application project, add new folder. Let's call this images and copy the image into that folder. Okay, now we want to associate this image with this image button. So go to the properties of the image button and use the image URL property to associate the image. So click on the properties icon, image URL, select the images folder, select calendar.jpg. So now what we basically want to do is when we run the application, initially when the page loads, the calendar will not be visible to the user. When they click the image button, we want this calendar to be visible, and then once the user picks the date, we want to populate this text box with that selected date and then hide the calendar. Okay, so when the page first loads, if it's the initial GET request, meaning if it's not a post back, then we want to hide the calendar. So calendar1 dot visible is equal to false. Alright, but then when I click this button, the image button, we want to show the calendar to the user. So calendar1 dot visible is equal to true. Okay, let's run this. As the application stands right now, when the web form first loads, the calendar will be invisible, and then when I click this image button, the calendar becomes visible. When I click on any of these dates here, that date should be populated within this text box, and then the calendar should become invisible. Now this is the most common technique that we use today to actually select a date from the end user. In fact, we also can use JavaScript calendar without posting back to the web server. We can actually select the date from the user. We'll look at that in a later example. But this ASP.NET calendar, when you select a date, it posts back to the server, and then on the server we can actually write server-side code to populate the text box. Okay, now let's see what actually happens when the user selects the date. When the user selects the date, the calendar control raises an event. And what is that event? Let's flip to the web form. Let's select the calendar control, go to the events of the calendar control, and if you look at this, there is an event called selection changed event. Whenever you select a date on the calendar, this event gets fired. So double click there, the event handler for the calendar control selection changed event is generated. So what should happen when a selection is changed? We want to retrieve the selected date from the calendar and populate that into the text box. So text box 1.text is equal to calendar1 dot selected date. Okay, now selected date returns a date time, but we want to convert that to string so that that can be set as the text for the text box control. And what else we want to do? We want to hide the calendar. So calendar1 dot visible is equal to false. Okay, so let's run this now. When the web form initially loads, the calendar will be invisible. I click the image button, the calendar becomes available, and when I select a date, look at that, I get the date there. And if you look at the date, I also have time there. We'll solve that in a bit. But there is another problem here. When I click on the calendar, look at that, the calendar is shown, but now let's say I don't want to select any date. Is there a way to close the calendar? No. You have to select a date to close the calendar. So I have to select another date. Now, how can we close the calendar without having to select the date? Okay, let's do that using this image button. So if the calendar is visible, then I actually want to hide it. Else, meaning if the calendar is not visible, then we want to show the calendar. So turn on the visibility. Okay, so we're using the same button to do that. So when we run the project now, when I click the image button once, if the calendar is not visible, that will be shown. If I click that again, it gets closed. Okay. Now the other problem is when I select the date, I'm getting the time as well, which I don't want. I just want the selected date from the user. Okay, so is there a way to knock off that time part of it? Yes, and there are several ways. In fact, you can also customize the format of that date and time in a variety of different ways. And let's actually look at them. There are several methods actually on this date time object. If you look at that, when I say dot, there are a load of methods. I can use toShortDateString. That's going to return just the date part of it. ToShortTimeString, that's going to return just the time. In fact, if you look at the slide here, toString is giving us this output, the date and the time. ToLongDateString gives us this one with the fully expanded month name, and ToShortDateString just gives us the two-part date, month, and year, and ToLongTimeString gives us hours, minutes, and seconds. ToShortTimeString gives us this, and similarly, you don't have to use these methods every time. Instead, you can also use the datetime format strings. Okay, when I say datetime.now.toString, to the toString method, if I pass in a small d, then short datetime is shown. If I pass in a capital D, the long datetime is shown. Okay, so there are a variety of datetime format strings and methods that we can use to actually format and customize these dates to suit our development needs. In fact, if you are thinking, do I have to remember all these method names and those format strings? You don't really have to. If you search Google MSD and datetime format strings, you get an MSDN article which lists all of them. Small d what it does, capital D what it does, etc. Alright, so let's flip to Visual Studio. So right now I just want the short date, so I can use small d there. And now if we actually run this and select the date, what's going to happen? I just get the date part of it. So only the date. Okay, cool. Now another issue with this calendar is that I'm able to select every date that I see within this calendar. Okay, so I'm able to select these dates 29, 30, 31. They actually belong to the month of October, and these 1 to 9, these dates belong to the month of December. Okay, and then I'm also able to select the Saturdays and Sundays. Now let's say I want to disable the selection of dates that doesn't belong to the current month, and weekends as well, Saturdays and Sundays. Is there a way to do that? Absolutely. Now if you think for a minute, how can we actually do that? You have to disable the selection for each cell within this calendar control. So there has to be an event that you can tap into to do that. So is there an event like that for the calendar control? Absolutely. Let's look at the events of the calendar control. So let me go to the web form and then select the calendar control, go to the properties of that. If you look at the event, there is an event called day render, and this event gets fired for each day within the calendar control. Okay, so there are 7 rows and columns here, 7 into 7, 49 times this event gets fired when this calendar is actually rendered. So let's actually double click that there. And then just to examine this event, I'm saying response.write, and you have here day render event args object coming into this event handler, and this has a property called day dot day number text. Now let's select that and let's put an HTML break here. So plus, and now let me run this and see what's going to happen. Now when the page loads, the calendar is not visible, so obviously this event will not be fired. But then when I click this button, the calendar becomes visible. So that's when this day render event gets fired, and let's see what is going to happen. Look at that. It's actually printing out the day number text from 29th of the previous month, 1 to 30 of the current month, and then the rest of the days that get shown in the calendar. until 9th. So for each day within this calendar, this event is raised. So we can tap into this event to actually achieve what we want to achieve. So what we want to achieve is that we want to disable the selection of any days that doesn't belong to the current month. So is there a way to identify if the day doesn't belong to a calendar? Absolutely. And how do we do that? You can use the same object that is coming into this event handler. So if e dot, and there is this day property, day is, there is a property called is other month. If the day belongs to other month, then this property returns true. So if the day is belonging to other month, or e dot day dot is weekend. If it's weekend, then I want to disable that as well. And similarly, if you want to disable the current day, or any day before the current day, you have a lot of flexibility to do that. Okay, so what I want to basically do here, e dot is selectable. E dot day dot is selectable, and I am setting that to false. That's all you have to do. So now if we go ahead and run this now, the user will not actually be able to select any weekend days or the other dates. Look at that, you cannot actually click on them. In fact, if you want, you can change the color. Look at this, even Saturdays, Sundays, I am not able to select them, but I can select any other date. Now let's say I want to change the back color of these weekends and the days that belong to other month. I can just say e dot the cell that displays that day. I want to change the back color maybe to red, which indicates that you shouldn't select them. So now when we run this and when the calendar actually renders, you can see the background color of the calendar actually for those days change. You can't select those days, but any other day you can select them. And there are a lot of other customizations that we can actually do for this calendar, which we will investigate in the next video session. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.